Welcome to the Bug Hunters Café. Have a seat anywhere.
Hi Marta. Hello Jason. What are you two looking at?
When we opened up this morning, there was a teeny cafe sitting on the table here.
A tiny cafe? Oh, wow! Did Unicorn take up a model building?
I don't think it's a model. Look closer.
It looks like they're miniature versions of us standing around the table. And look at the tiny unicorn in the corner.
Here, try the magnifying glass.
They are looking at another mini cafe,
Best as we can tell, it's an infinite recursion.
and we are on top of it.
Not exactly. Look up.
Giant versions of us!
Maybe Ned Batchelder will have some ideas on how to fix this. He's been coding for over 4 decades, although perhaps he's best known these days for writing coverage.py. You probably know him as Ned Bat in the various Python channels. By day, he works at OpenEdX.
You think he can fix this?
It's worth a shot. He totally geeks out about fractals, and this is sort of similar, so... here he is now.
Hey guys, what's going on?
Tiny Cafe infinite, we have an infinite recursion here.
Oh, look at that.
And I was told you can make me be a giant.
Yeah.
Or maybe I don't have to. It's a little imposing what's going on in here.
Yeah. We'll do our best to ignore it, but I don't know if you have any ideas on how to fix this.
Well, if it's coded in Python, we only have to worry about 1,000 levels of recursion. So maybe that's comfort.
Oh my gosh, I compiled it without that limit.
Well, then it'll crash pretty soon. So it'll all be over in just a moment.
Will it hurt?
I've never experienced being inside a recursion-based crash before.
Well, and who knew it would come in handy in the real world to have a recursion limit in Python?
Oh, absolutely.
If you can call this cafe the real world.
It's real if you believe it hard enough. It runs on fate, and that way we don't have to pay taxes.
Very nice.
Hey, have a seat. Can I get you anything to drink? The coffee's on Soft Terrific. They're the ones who sponsor these chats.
I have some coffee in the morning, but I tend to be decaffeinated for most of the day. If you think that unicorn's weird, you don't want me on a second cup of coffee. I'll have a strawberry smoothie if you can whip one up.
Yeah, I can get that for you, and I'll get your usual Bojan.
Thank you. I really love our espresso without coffee. Such a good stuff. So, Ned.
Hey.
Did you know that I started doing test-driven development because of you?
Is that right? You're going to blame me
Yep.
for this?
Yes, absolutely. And I also taught a bunch of people to do that as well. So there's 20 people, all because of you, doing some test-driven development out there.
That's good. We're making the world a better place, one test at a time.
Yep. So how does this make you feel?
It's good. I personally am a huge fan of automated testing. Some people used to call it test infected, but maybe during a pandemic, that's not the best term to use. It's hugely satisfying to me to write a test and see the test pass. When I get bug reports, I tend to write a failing test first, just to prove that I really know what's failing, and then also to give me the satisfaction to know that I've fixed the problem. So to me, it's a huge part of writing good software is having a really comprehensive test suite.
Yep. For me, tests are basically a permission to do refactoring. I can refactor code and I know nobody's gonna cry.
Exactly.
Without tests, it's a nightmare. I tried that once, it did not work.
You mentioned test-driven development, and we can get into subtleties of what that term means or doesn't mean. I've had a hard time adopting that term as it's explained by its strongest proponents. If you read the guides about test-driven development, and it says things like, first write a test that asserts that the answer is 4, and then you write a function that just returns 4, and so the test passes, and then you refactor the function to have it actually compute something. And that always, to me, seemed to take it to an extreme, and I don't know if people really do that. I certainly have not gotten to that level of test-driven development. I do test-driven development in that, as I said, I will write a test before I try to fix the bug I'm trying to fix. Often that test is a really convenient way for me to just drive the code so that I can debug and figure out where it's failing and what fix has to be made. But then the test remains in the test suite as a regression test, so it's handy that way.
Yeah.
Here's your strawberry smoothie, Ned, and here's your espresso without coffee, Bojan.
Thank you.
I love that it sparkles.
Those are free,
Nice.
and you get one refill, but only one.
Only one. All right, well.
Yeah. For me, definition of test-driven development is basically write enough tests so you're not afraid of your code. And that's pretty much all of it. I don't go much into you need to do this thingy, you need to have this ritual. No, just write enough tests, have good coverage, and everything's gonna be nice.
Yep. And I'm assuming that the reason I got you started on test-driven development was because of my association with coverage.py. And the irony for me is that working on coverage.py as a tool, there are large chunks of its code that cannot be coverage measured because it's the code that is doing the coverage measurement. And so I have to satisfy myself with, I forget what it is, something like 93% coverage right now. So other projects get to go to 100% coverage. Coverage.py does not, which is a cruel irony in the scheme of things.
Well, and I remember reading an article you wrote a while back about how 100% code coverage is not the panacea that we tend to think of it as.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I've put it is the problem with 100% coverage is now you've gotten to the end of the highway, and you still have to keep driving, but you don't have guideposts anymore, because 100% coverage doesn't mean that your code is completely tested. There's all sorts of things that statement or branch coverage can't tell you about what your tests are doing. You don't know, for instance, if you've completely mapped out the full data domain of the functions you're testing. You just know that you've run all the lines of code. There could easily be bugs still lurking there if you give it unusual enough data.
Which every user will do.
Right. Eventually you will. And there are other tools that can help you with that. Property-based testing is a fascinating concept, and the hypothesis library does a really good job of implementing that in Python. I haven't quite wrapped my head around how to use it routinely, but it's certainly, when you can use it, it is astounding.
I absolutely love hypothesis. It's so nice. And I basically, the way I use it is for every endpoint in my APIs, I just use a hypothesis to generate the data that's going to go in. And it figures super fast how it can break my system, especially with Unicode.
Right. Yeah, hypothesis it's really good at generating data, and when a test fails, then trying to simplify the data back down to the smallest input that might generate that failure. The challenge is that you have to both figure out how to express what is the valid domain of the inputs for your functions, and then also have some kind of test at the end for whether it went okay. And in some cases, whether it went okay can just be, did it not throw an exception? But you still have to figure out how to tell hypothesis, these are the inputs I want. And again, in the coverage.py case, coverage.py takes as its input a Python program. I don't know how to tell hypothesis, start generating me random valid Python programs. And then at the end, what coverage tells you is, these are the lines that ran in that program. And I don't know how to assess whether that answer is right without knowing what the input is. So at sort of that macro level for coverage.py, I don't see how to use hypothesis. There's some data manipulation routines in coverage.py that I have used hypothesis for, where it was a much simpler, you put in this data and you should get out that output, and this characteristic of the output must be true no matter what the input was. And that's the sort of tests that hypothesis is good for.
Testing the testing framework is definitely something that I've had difficulty with as well, because I developed a testing framework in C++, and the same sort of situation. It's like, how do you test the testing framework?
Yep.
It's like you could pull out another testing framework, but then you really don't want to have to do that. There's this whole thing about dog fooding anyway, and so you test with the testing framework that you're building, but then when something fails, it's like, okay, well, is it failing because the test failed, or is it failing because testing with the test failed? And how do we even test if I can't even compile yet?
Yep. Yeah, and in the coverage.py case, another complication is that it's intimately tied to some of the details of how CPython actually traces code, and that changes from version to version. And in particular, in 3.10, which is just had a beta 3 release yesterday. In particular, with 3.10, Mark Shannon has been doing a lot of work for PEP 616, I think it is, to correct the tracing, which means that it's shifting around a lot. And every release of 3.10 has been me running the coverage.py test suite and then sorting through all the failures, which are my fault and which are CPython's fault, and then writing bugs against CPython, and then waiting for the next release of 3.10 to see those got fixed, but then some others broke. I wrote a bug report just this morning, actually, because one of my tests in coverage.py passes on Linux and Mac and fails on Windows. And it's got nothing to do with the operating system. It's just which lines got traced by the trace function. So it must come down to some kind of compiler optimization difference on the different platforms or something. I don't know. It's been a long slog, 3.10, getting through these kinds of tracing bugs.
Bugs can come from some weird spots, and you said you've been coding somewhere in the ballpark of 4 decades. So Python was not your first rodeo.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, I am, as I describe it, I am crazy old. I started thinking about writing software in the 1970s when I was a teenager. And actually, my mother was a software engineer. She wrote in PL1. We had IBM 360 system manuals lying around the house, which were fascinating. So I've been steeped in software and in fact, I actually own some computer books that belonged to my mother's father because he was a statistician. And so, this goes back a long way in my family. So yeah, I guess the first thing that I was looking at were basic programs in magazines like Creative Computing, if you've heard of that magazine from the 1970s, which was kind of eye-opening. That computers existed that kids could touch and they could write programs, and you could look at a magazine and see the code, and it was utterly fascinating to me.
So when did you make your professional entrance into coding? Like what was your first tech job?
Well, let's see. So I guess my very first. Well, it's interesting. So I'm going to apologize now. I tend in conversation I tend to refer to blog posts of mine a lot because I've been writing a blog for 19 years or whatever it is, and so most interesting ideas end up on the blog posts at some point. And so when I refer to them, I'll refer to a blog post. Actually, the very first blog post I ever wrote was about my very first job. And I don't know if you can call this a professional job. I was a kid and I went to a computer expo, and I was poking around at all the microcomputers, which were, I don't know what the CompuColor was particularly interesting because you could program it in BASIC and draw graphics in color. And I walked up to the machine at the display, and I knew enough to Control-C the program that was running and look at the code and fiddle with it and make it do something different. Excuse me. And I thought, pretty soon the sales guy is going to get mad at me and kick me out of the booth. He came over and looked at it, and he said, "I'll tell you what, kid, if you stick around and keep doing that, I'll buy you lunch." And because he thought it was cool to see, because he didn't know how to change the code. He was just slinging hardware. But he thought it was cool that, there's a kid standing there just kind of showing off what he could do. And so I got a hot dog out of the deal. Is that a professional job? I don't know.
It is. It's super awesome.
Yeah. I guess my first truly professional job is I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I actually worked for the computer science department there for a year while my wife was finishing up her master's degree, which is where I learned PostScript on the Apple Laser Writer, which got me a job at Digital Equipment Corporation working in the printer department. which was my first cubicle office kind of job, and that was great.
You're the only person in the world that says that. My cubicle job was great.
Well, I know when to put it that way, but working at digital on PostScript printers was a lot of fun, and it it still had kind of a feel of the old digital where we're all a bunch of hackers, and it doesn't seem like a big deal now, but at the time it had a worldwide network of all of its computers called DECnet, and that was not something that existed in general in the mid 80s, and so it felt kind of amazing to be in that large an organization with that many people who were interested to do the same thing that I was interested to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
So back in that era, do you remember any particularly interesting bugs?
Well, it's interesting that you ask about that because there was a particularly interesting bug from that era, which was so I was working. So I mentioned the Apple LaserWriter, which is known as the first PostScript printer, but it was the first PostScript printer to ship. But actually, Digital signed a contract with Adobe to make a PostScript printer before Apple signed their contract. It's just that Digital's laser printers were big office machines. There was a 40-page a minute printer called the LPS 40. And I was working on the team that built the software that fed print jobs to the printer, and I was writing the PostScript that would print the banner pages and things like that. And on the LPS 20, which was a 20-page a minute printer, we got a bug report once, and the title of the bug report was "Print this file, you'll get a paper jam." And we thought, yeah, come on, right? And we printed the file, and the printer got a paper jam. And we thought, well, that's weird. And we printed the file again, and the printer got a paper jam. So we printed a different file, and it printed fine. And we printed a third file, and it printed fine. And we went back and printed the bug report file, and the printer got a paper jam. And what kind of demonic thing is this? It seemed impossible. But the thing about a PostScript printer is that PostScript is a general purpose programming language that just happens to get used in very simple ways to draw pages to get printed. But in a 20-page a minute printer, the drum rotates once every 3 seconds. And if a page can be rendered in less than 3 seconds, then the drum will stay at full speed, printing 20 pages a minute. If a page happens to take longer than 3 seconds, then the drum has to stop until the page is ready. And then when the page is ready, the drum will start up again to print the page. And this printer was in development. It hadn't shipped yet. And there was a bug in its firmware that if the drum stopped, but then tried to start again really soon, like maybe it was still had a little momentum in it or something, like there was just a weird timing window that if your page took just enough a little bit longer, just enough than 3 seconds, then the machinery would get jammed up and you'd get a paper jam reliably.
Wow.
And it was a great example of the abstractions we deal with, right? As a software guy, I think of a printer as just like, well, yeah, you just send it pages and it just makes pages. There's nothing tricky going on in there other than gears and belts and stuff. But you put a computer in there with computation and timing issues, and all sorts of weird things can happen. And once we understood that that's what it was, we sent the bug over to the hardware guys, and they're like, oh yeah, and they fixed it, and it never happened again. Like, it was no big deal to them. Like, oh, I can see what the problem is. And to us, it was, The Exorcist or something. Yeah, it was weird.
So it sounds like the running joke that that debugging printers involves some form of the black arts is a very old joke.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, we knew all about like connecting printers to computers and sending jobs to them, but us software guys didn't know anything about the timing issues that might happen in the drivetrain of a printer. So it was eye-opening that could happen.
Wow.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why does everybody complain about their printers? I had 3 of them, and there's always some crazy problem with them, with drivers or something like that. Tell me your insight. How do I make printers fear me, not the other way around?
I think it's because it's one of those things that, as people, we take for granted that if I have a piece of paper and a pencil, it's really easy to make marks on it. And if I want to print a thing, it's really easy to see what that thing is going to be, and it's not that different than what it looked like on the screen, so what's the big deal? But actually getting a machine connected to another machine is a big deal. And I mean, drivers are much better than they used to be. I don't think it's that big a deal to get the drivers right these days. Um, Although, as I say that, I've got a second monitor on my desk at home, which doesn't know where the mouse doesn't know. It's not a continuous space to the mouse. It kind of moves to the right and then hops an inch to the left and then goes to the right again if I just drag the mouse across it. So why is that hard? I don't know. It's another abstraction that's, I want to pretend is simple, but to some other engineer, it's actually a whole headache of a job that they have to get right. So
Good answer. Nobody knows what's happening there.
nobody knows what's happening there.
Well, and you've used a phrase a couple of times that seems to come up a lot with bugs, and that's abstractions. You know,
Exactly. And I think that's one of the difficulties of the software world is that because it's entirely virtual, we have unlimited levels of abstraction, right? Kind of like the infinite recursion of the cafe we're sitting in right now. There's abstractions above us and abstractions below us, and it's up to us to decide which abstractions we want to treat as white boxes and which we want to treat as black boxes. And when you've got an abstraction that you chose to treat as a black box, but your mental model of it was wrong, this is what Joel Spolsky has called leaky abstractions. That's a great place for bugs to happen, right? I thought it was going to do this, and it didn't. And that's because I modeled it simplistically and incorrectly. But you have to, right? You can't, like I've seen people in for instance in IRC, someone will say, I want to know what Python is really doing. I want to, like, what's under the hood there? And then some wise ass will say, well, do you want to talk about transistors? Like, how are you deciding that what the C code in C Python is doing is the real thing and not what the chip is doing is the real thing? And I don't care about transistors. I'm perfectly happy to have a laptop in front of me, which I know has, what is it, a billion, a trillion? I don't even know how high it goes these days. A lot of transistors. And I don't have to think about any of them. It's great.
yeah, we're both in that room, and I could probably bet you sizable money on who said that too. But
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
like three or four candidates here. I see
No,
you guys.
I think your first guess would be right.
And if not, then that's the second guess. Yeah, no, as well, and of course, abstractions also are not sacred. I think it's another mistake we tend to make. Is like we tend to treat some abstractions as somehow sacred, and there are some that are harder to supplant than others. We use C because it works so darn well. And everyone talks about how Rust is going to replace C. I don't think Rust is going to replace C. I think Rust is going to prove to be useful in many cases where C is presently useful, and probably more suitable in some cases. But I don't think anything ever replaces anything. I mean, COBOL's still actively developed.
COBOL's out there. Yep.
But it's like it's just a question of how difficult is it to replace this abstraction. I mean, if we want to talk about, okay, well, do we want to re-implement Python in Rust? Okay, that's more feasible than, okay, do we want to switch from binary to a ternary system because we're on a quantum computer? Now we're in a much more complicated realm. But
Exactly.
it's all invention.
Sure. And someone could, 20 years from now, it might be that the laptops we'd be using are based on a completely different thing, right? That Apple's laptops now are no longer, originally they were on Motorola and then they switched to Intel, and that seemed like a huge OMG moment. And now they've decided they're going to just continue their vertical integration by designing their own chips completely, and now they're shipping M1s. And again, that's an abstraction I don't have to care about, right? I don't happen to have an M1 laptop, but when I do get one, I don't think I'm going to have to care that the chip has changed underneath.
Oh, and actually, speaking of bugs and M1s, there is an open, like, there's a public security issue on those because apparently there's some pretty serious shared memory problems on the M1s.
Yeah.
Like, it is possible for program A to access the shared memory of program B, without. And the thing is, unfortunately, it's because they chose to ignore part of the ARM spec. They figured it was optional, and it wasn't optional, and it's actually baked into the hardware. So all of the M1s that are shipping right now have an unmitigatable hardware issue. So if you're thinking about getting an Apple Silicon, wait, because the M1s aren't secure.
I let my company buy the hardware, and I have a relatively new laptop, but it's new to me. I think they bought it back in a summer ago, and it's been sitting in a stack someplace. So I tend to be a late adopter of technology in the first place. I can't tell you how many times I've heard of an idea and I thought, that's not a good idea. And then it turns out to be, of course, a great idea. Just because I'm skeptical and distrustful of anything new. So,
well, and some of that probably just comes from, messing with printers long enough. You learned that the early iterations of hardware don't work.
Well, I guess that the bug story I just told was about the early iterations don't work.
Yeah, I think, I like to know what's going on under the hood, but I mean, it's a good point. Like, Scott Ford brought this up before. We were talking with him here, actually, and he brought up, it's like, okay, well, where do you stop? Where do you stop, recursing into the, because this abstraction is all the way down. I think it is helpful to understand the layer just below you, but like usually not much further below that.
It's an interesting thing because, software engineers in general, we're in this field because we're interested in how things work and in making things, and you have to know how things work in order to make things. And sometimes people ask questions that are really just curiosity, and sometimes they'll ask the same question, but they'll think the answer matters. I mean, a classic example is the question of which integers in Python are interned and which are not. And you see this trivia question posted all the time. Why is 200 plus 1 is 201, but 1,000 plus 1 is not 1,001? And it's hard to speak Python like that in a cafe, but I hope people know what I'm referring to. And the answer comes down to, because Python chose to intern some integers and chose not to intern others. And by the way, it just doesn't matter. Like, there's no real program that cares about that distinction. So some people will look into it because it's just interesting. It is kind of interesting to see the implementation choices that they made and how that can expose itself in the language. And some people won't understand that there are details like that don't matter. They'll think somehow that mastering Python means knowing all of that. And then, by the way, 3.14 will come out and they'll change that decision, and that's okay because it didn't matter in the first place. So
yeah, well, it is tends to throw a lot of people off. Is like, well, it's there, and so you say, is true, is false, is none. So why don't we say is 42 or is this string? It's and I think a lot of these questions sometimes come from misunderstanding why something's there in the first place. And then you go back to that law of, someone's going to rely on every single observable behavior of your code.
Right. And I think, if I could go back 30 years and shift time somehow, I would tell Guido, don't make is a keyword. It's not useful enough to be a keyword. And it's just, it's an attractive nuisance to have a word in the language that you pretty much actually should never use. And the readability is kind of a trap in the first place. People will write if X is 1 or 2. And there are two mistakes in that. It looks perfectly reasonable, and any English reader understands what someone would mean if X is 1 or 2. But it's not going to work in Python for a bunch of reasons. And that's what I've called Python's unfortunate readability. It didn't need to have is as a word, and I like or as a word, but people have to learn that it can't be used in the same way that you use it in English.
Yeah. Well, and then someone says, well, how do I learn Python? And then of course you regularly get somebody, especially in the IRC room, going, well, it's just pseudocode, and you just want to clobber them into unconsciousness with their laptops.
Right. It's readable. It's executable pseudocode. Well, one, that's an oxymoron. And two, no, there's actual rules that you have to follow, and if you don't follow them, your program will be wrong, or it won't run at all. If X is 1 or 2 is always true, no matter what X is. It's unfortunate that not only is it wrong in 2 ways, but it's not a syntax error, and your program will just run, but not correctly.
Yeah, and for anyone who's baffled about this, if X is 1, is because 1 is a truthy value.
Well, in this case, it's because 2 is a truthy value, because X is 1 will be a predicate, which maybe is true, maybe is not, but either way, 2 will end up being true.
That's
and
true,
the or
yeah.
will come out true. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, it'll always be true.
Parentheses, save us all.
Yeah, so I mean, and I love Python. I'm deeply embedded in the Python world in a variety of ways. And I think that readability is, for the most part, is a good thing and has helped Python grow into new domains. Every 5 years, there's some new domain that Python is taking over. I heard someone describe Python as the invasive species of the programming languages. You introduce kudzu into a place, and pretty soon all the plants are kudzu, and Python is kind of like that too. So it's not the most flattering description,
but Floridians will totally agree with that assessment of Python. So hey,
yeah, exactly.
Bug Hunters Café. This is Marta. Yes, we're open. In fact, we're open 24/7 at bughunters.cafe. You can also find us on Twitter, Dev, and Instagram as Bug Hunters Café. Oh, you knew that already. You sound familiar. You're me? Yes, that infinity incursion is weird, isn't it? Well, what can I do for you? For me? For you, me? Me, you, me. This is weird. You're out of creamer. Yeah, I can spare some if we can figure out how to get it there. Oh, what do you know? We're out of creamer too. Oh, true. A droplet of creamer for me is more than enough for you. I just need to find an eyedropper. While we're on the topic, how did you call me? I should call myself on Level Up and get some creamer too.
So Ned, it's kind of fun having you here too, because like you are, I have known you in the tech community longer than most people in my network, because I got my start wandering into the Python IRC room, and there was Ned Bat and everyone else, and I still remember my first question. There I was on the front porch of my home trying to learn Python, coming from Visual Basic.net, which I taught myself, and I said, "How do you declare a type in Python?" And Habnabit says you're a data type. And then you and he and several others go on to explain how Python is a dynamically typed language and completely blow my mind, and then I just never leave.
Yep. How do you get down off a duck, right? You don't. Yeah, I've been in IRC for, I don't know, about a decade. In some ways I came late to it, but being in it for a decade now is a long time. And I still love the Python IRC channel. It's easy these days to also dip into Discord or various Slack workspaces or whatever, and they have their advantages. But IRC has a sort of purity and a simplicity that I really like. The Python Discord is really interesting because it's enormous. There must be 100,000 users in it, but it's also incredibly chaotic. I describe it as having a median age of about 15, and that's taking into account that there are 12-year-olds and they're claiming to be 15. Because of its gaming background, Discord just skews incredibly young.
Yeah, I can't wrap. I tried. I can't wrap my head around the Discord. It's just because it is chaotic. I like. Well, okay. I actually set up a Discord channel for a conference, and I remember Guido came into it. He went, "Okay, this is an angry fruit salad." And I'm sitting there going, he's not wrong.
He's not wrong. No, but what I will say about the Python Discord is that they've done a great job creating an organization of people to run the place. There are 3 owners and maybe a dozen administrators and 20 moderators and 100 helpers and this whole hierarchy of roles. And they have weekly staff meetings and activities going on, and they run contests and themes, and it really is a whole world unto itself. Python IRC is much simpler. There's, I don't know, a dozen of us regulars or something, and people come in and ask questions, and for the most part they get answers. We try to avoid the classic IRC dynamic of you're asking wrong, so shut up, or come back later when you've gotten a clue, kinds of neckbeards, frankly, although I can't quite throw stones about neckbeards.
Yeah.
So we try to be a nice IRC channel.
Yeah. Although I will say that IRC is getting nicer. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, but all the work that's been occurring from 2 angles. You got the Python community, which has been trying really, really hard to be decent. And then you have the dev community, which I'm a part of, and they're really trying to bring decency in and compassion and equity into the space. And that has started permeating all different levels of programming, I'm noticing, and that's even spilling over into rooms where it's like I can actually stand being in some of the C++ rooms that I quit 8 years ago because it was just intolerable. And it's like, oh wow, they're actually being decent now. What a concept.
I hope that's a trend overall, and I'd like to think that Python led the charge there, and that we in the IRC channel tried really hard to be that way. I know I hang out in other IRC channels where the main person who answers questions mostly wants to tell people that they should have read the documentation first. And it just doesn't need to be that way. And actually, I literally ask that guy every once in a while, why are you here? Like, why do you hang out in this channel if all you want to do is be annoyed at people for not reading the docs?
Right. It's half the time we can't find the docs. We can't find the thing we need in the docs.
Right. And exactly. And what's the point? Do you really think that chiding someone for not reading the docs is going to make them go read the docs? Probably not. It's like whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, other than feeling superior, you're not accomplishing it. And people just don't sort of step back and think about it. Tough love, it tends to be lots of people's first hammer that they reach for, and it's just not an effective tool.
No,
but it makes them feel good. It makes them feel superior.
Well, I think IRC is interesting too because we've also gone through a bit of an inadvertent community purge, because some people know we moved the Python IRC room, the Ubuntu IRC room, and almost everything else.
Lots of others. Yeah,
moved from Freenode, which has been around since Methuselah, to to this brand new Libera.chat. And I think the big thing is like, we were talking about this, there's mixed reactions. It's like there's people who are like, oh my gosh, that was so much acrimony, and I'm one of those people. I was there. There's people who go, wait, IRC's a thing still? There's other people who go, what is IRC in the first place? And there's people who are like, well, it's just a nasty, hostile takeover of the staff got kicked out of Freenode because they were being nasty people, and so they got what's coming to them, and all these wildly varying versions of events. I was there for a lot of it. I was there for most of it. I logged in the morning of the explosion, and watching it slowly. The departing staff. So we still have Freenode. It's just now known as Libera. The staff moved.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of people wouldn't have any idea what we're talking about, right? Because if you're not in IRC, or you only occasionally dip in, you may have heard there was some drama about Freenode, but like, what's the big deal? And the short story at the end of it all is, a crazy guy tried to take something over and completely burned it to the ground, but that's okay because IRC is just a way for people to get together, and all of those people are still getting together on IRC, just on a different server.
Exactly. And all we did is change domain names.
Right. We changed domain names in our RIC client, and we're all still talking. And actually, it's a little bit better because the ultimate irony is that some of the people that we had come to know because they were the worst disruptors of polite conversation are now part of the staff of the old Freenode, and they're all still over there sifting through the ashes, and they're not bothering us over on Libera, right? So we've kind of like all of the good people just jumped ship and went someplace else, and the bad people are all, I don't know what they're doing, scrabbling or fighting or lamenting their demise. I don't know what they're doing. I don't have to know. I can just be over here where the nice people are. It's great.
Apparently, from some people who are straddling networks, apparently largely pretending they have a network is the big thing right
that's
now.
What they're doing over there. Yeah,
and anybody who has heard about this and just think, well, okay, it was overblown, because I was hearing that a lot. It's like, oh well, this, you know, the concerns that the outgoing staff has about this new guy is just overblown. It's not a conspiracy. Everything's okay. It's like, we saw within a month everything they said they were concerned about happened.
Yeah.
We had channel takeovers. We had mass kicks of trustworthy people. We had, and then he blocked the bouncers. And the big concern right now is that, okay, is he going to now be monitoring traffic going through his own bouncer? This was the primary reason why everyone left, is because we didn't know what was going to be done with those servers. It was a privacy concern above anything.
Yeah, it's all. I'm really glad to have it in my rearview mirror at this point, because it doesn't, like, for a while there, for about a month there, it was like, what's this storm coming, and who are these people who are talking about it, and how would we decide what to do, and should we move, should we not move, should we be on both? And now it's just really clear that we did the right thing and we moved networks, and you know, the Python community is alive and well on IRC, on Discord, you know, all sorts of places, and one crazy guy buying a network can't break that, which is great.
And of course, that's where IRC's staying power comes from in the first place, is because if that happened at Discord, if that happened at Slack, if that happened at, you know, any of these chat services that everybody loves, you'd lose the whole network. It would be gone. Discord or Slack or whatever would cease to exist. But IRC is not, it's not a company. It is a protocol like HTTP. And you can't get rid of HTTP.
And some people said, you know, oh, well, you know, what if you had to move, why not just use something more modern, like, I don't know, Matrix or Gitter or something? And the first reason is just, well, we were just kind of protecting what we had and moving from one place to another. But the other is that if we said no more IRC, let's go someplace else, it would have been 3 or 4 different places, and it would have gotten truly splintered. And this way it hasn't. So, and we like IRC.
We do. It's simple. It's straightforward. It's there's a peaceful component to that. It's like, it doesn't take much to get on and to use it, and you're not getting bombarded with notifications and emojis and GIFs and all this stuff. And
I'm very impressed by the flexibility that Discord offers to shape the interactions, but it is overwhelming. I like threading. I mean, it's great to be able to thread things, and IRC sometimes does suffer from all the conversations happening in one giant long stream. But we do fine. If you haven't tried IRC, you should come and join us. Bojan, try IRC. Come on. Install a client. Get on the IRC channel. Be with the uncool kids.
But the cool kids have GIFs of cats doing funny stuff.
But we still have GIFs of cats. We just post static links to them.
That's right. Well, interestingly, in the main channel in Python Discord, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but it is interesting to me, the differences. Discord does let you post images, except that has been disabled in the main channel in the Python Discord because it was just too much. It was all, you know, reaction GIFs and memes, and no one could discuss anything because of the flood of images. And so they've just turned that off.
Well, it reminds me a bit of the classic rule that we had in IRC way back was no lol.
No, that was a long-standing Python rule, no lol. And there was one particular op in the channel who loved to kick people out of the channel for saying lol. But that rule has been gone for a very long time.
It has. I knew, of course, the point of it originally was to cut down on the noise, but it just kind of became a rule unto itself, and you know, very non-Pythonic of a rule to become a rule unto itself.
Right. No, I totally understand when you're guiding a community in discussion that there sometimes you have to say to them, sit up straight or in some way. Pay attention to the norms and interact in ways that people expect. And that no lol was that IRC version of that. We're not here for chat speak. We want to talk. And the no pictures in the Python Discord is a similar thing, right? It's not going to work if you paste pictures, so you can't paste pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Right.
You mentioned Matrix a minute ago, and I will say I've tried Matrix some. I think Matrix may wind up becoming a critical part of the IRC infrastructure over the next few years because it is also decentralized and because it
Hmm.
works with IRC. And so it's like we don't have to give up IRC. We can actually
Interesting.
work right over the protocols, but it
Yeah,
can bridge over to Discord. It can bridge to Slack. It can bridge to Telegram. Um, and it just becomes this central point that everything meets. And so whatever you join on, you're able to talk to everybody else.
I've never tried it. Maybe I should.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, and it's free open source protocol. And that's the thing. That is the critical thing. Matrix is not a product; it's a protocol.
Right.
IRC is not a project; it's a protocol, and I think that's a that's a big thing. But on the topic of support channels, in any case, um, you mentioned asking the right way, and that there's some rooms that get really fussy
Yeah.
about asking the right way. But of course, there are ways to ask questions that don't work. What,
Oh,
what
of
would you
course.
What would you say is kind of generally speaking the right way to ask a question?
Well, I guess the hardest thing about asking questions is that you're, let's role play for a sec. I'm a dude who's got a problem, right? I've been struggling with a thing. It's in front of me. I'm confused. I need help. Now, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take one slice of my mental state and put it in text someplace. Let's say an IRC channel, Python Discord. Either way, I'm typing a question, and it's not going to be super long, right? Because I just want to type my question, so it's going to be maybe 60, 80 characters. But I've got this whole path that I've been following and details that I understand that I didn't think were important, but maybe are important, but I don't know because I'm a noob and I'm confused. So it's really hard to get the right slice of details into a question. And especially if the whole point, like I said, you're confused. So how do you know what are the important details? And this is one of the frustrations sometimes in IRC or in other support channels. Someone will ask a question, and I'll often want more detail, more background detail. And sometimes that comes out as like, well, why do you want to pickle that unpickleable object or whatever it was? Like literally, I saw this question this morning. How do I pickle an unpickleable object? Okay, that's a really easy question to answer. You don't. You can't. By definition, you can't. So we're going to need to talk some more in order to find out what's really going on and what you need to do. But some people get aggravated if you say to them, why do you want to do that? And that's because asking someone why can sound like you shouldn't want to do that. You're doing it wrong. And I get into trouble about that a lot because I love asking why. And usually what I mean is, I'm really interested to hear more details about your situation. I'm not trying to say you're doing it wrong. But it just comes across that way. And words make a huge difference. Little words make a big difference. Just as an example, just for my use in IRC, I have a number of keyboard macros. And one of them is literally the phrase, if you don't mind me asking. And that's so that I can say, if you don't mind me asking, why do you want to pickle an unpickleable object? Or if you don't mind me asking, can you tell me more about where this object came from? And that's just a phrase that literally sort of means nothing. It doesn't add anything to the content of the question, but it adds a lot to the emotion of the question.
Yeah.
And right, it puts me in a subservient position, and it's explicitly asking permission to ask the question, so it softens the blow of the why. And I put it in a macro because I want to type it a lot because that's what's going to make for a productive discussion.
Yeah.
But that's a big IRC problem. It's not just an IRC problem. Anywhere that you're trying to get help from strangers with no context in a starved textual medium like Discord or Slack or IRC, everyone's going to try to be really brief, but they need to get more information from you. So how do you ask in a way that doesn't seem intrusive or judgmental?
Yeah. And of course,
It takes work.
I put it in dead simple Python that, just expect, if you're going to ask a question, expect that people are going to ask you why. And it's not that we're saying you don't know. We want to understand your thought process, because usually you don't want to try and solve a bug if the assumptions made to get to that bug were wrong. It will be much easier and more productive for you if you can back up and fix
Yep.
the broken assumption. But because we don't
Right.
know your brain, we have to walk back there with you.
Right. And sometimes you get to recognize the kinds of questions that really we need to go about 2 steps back up the path to how you got that weird data. Like people ask, how do I unbackslash this string I got? And the answer usually is, well, you don't. You go to where you got the string and you treat it a little bit differently. And sometimes the right thing to do, and it's rare that people would do this, is answer the literal question first, and then also say, but by the way, there might be an easier way to do this. And that I find also works, because, and overall, my philosophy is try to make yes sentences more than you make no sentences. And lots of sentences are heard as yeses or as nos, often just by virtue of subtle word choices that you make. Like, why are you doing that is basically a no, right? I'm not answering the question you asked me yet. I am redirecting your line of thought. I'm giving you pushback in some way. It's an opening to a conversation, but it still will come across as a no. And so you need to try to turn it into a yes.
Sure. And please, if you're answering, don't put "let me Google that for you," because if they knew the search terms,
Exactly.
are hard. Search terms
Yes.
are very difficult.
Right. Well, and sometimes someone will come in and say, how do I get the length of a Python array? And we all know that what they mean is a list. But it doesn't help to say Python doesn't have arrays. And I mean, sometimes you'll see people answer it that way. Python doesn't have arrays. It's just not helpful. Like, why are you in IRC if that's the way you're going to answer people? Just so you can feel superior.
Absolutely. Welcome to Python. Please mind the furniture on your way down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Been using that introduction in that room for about a decade now.
You can just as easily answer len of the list. And by the way, for your future Googling, they're called lists, not arrays. That's why you couldn't find it. You thought it was called an array, but it's not. It's called a list. So, yeah, dealing with people is tricky.
Yeah, I think most of us go into programming thinking we're going to talk with machines, and we end up talking way more with people than machines.
That's right. Yeah, I have a twin sister. She's a psychologist. We kind of split it in half. She took the people, and I took the machines. That's how we divided up the world.
That's awesome. I always wanted to have an evil twin. Is she evil?
Is she evil? No, she's not evil.
So you're the evil twin.
I must be. That's right. That's what they say, right? If you don't know who the evil twin is, it's you.
Ned, I have a question about algorithms.
Yeah,
what
algorithms.
What would you say when somebody asks you what is the best way to learn algorithms?
So this is a question that comes up a lot in the, and I hate to keep harping on it, but the Python Discord, because of the age range, there's a lot of students there and college students, and they're thinking about how they get out of being students and into being employees. And so there's a lot of people trying to study data structures and algorithms. And unfortunately, I think the reason they're trying to study it is because they're going to get interviewed on it. And I absolutely hate the idea that they are going to get interviewed on it, because it's kind of irrelevant. If you get a job because you can invert a red-black tree or whatever it is, I don't even know if that sentence makes sense. If you can get a job because you can invert a red-black tree, you're going to show up at that job, and if you literally write code to invert a red-black tree, your boss is going to say, why did you waste your time doing that? There's a library to do that. Because you spent a lot of time to probably introduce bugs and do it slowly. So why don't you just use the third-party code that already does that? So I don't want to turn people away from learning whatever it is they want to learn. The question is, why do they want to learn it? If you can study for an interview, then it's a bad interview. So studying for data structures and algorithms, it can be fascinating. Like knowing how hash tables work is great. I think Bloom filters are fascinating and hardly ever used, but it's amazing that they exist. If you've never looked into what a Bloom filter is, go and look. It's a great topic. I don't want to implement one. I'll just know what it's called, so the next time I need it, I can go and find the Python package on PyPI and install it.
If I can add in there too really quick, it's like I recommend knowing algorithms, but usually learning them when you need them. Like, okay, I'm going to use this sort method. What's going on under the hood? Just, not to be able to sit down and re-implement timsort, but just to have some an idea of, okay, what's happening here, because it does have effects on how you use it. Like, there are different sorting algorithms that are used, and dual pivot quicksort is not good, and that's the default, by the way, on Java. You don't want to use that on a linked list. And when you know what dual pivot quicksort does, you know why you don't want to use it on a linked list. And so it helps to know that, to like Ned mentioned, having that mental model. But don't waste your time memorizing how to actually code it yourself, because you're probably not going to.
Yeah, I think knowing things like what is a linked list and what's a hash table are really good things to know. But like Jason said, the details are things if you know where those details are, so that in the rare possibility that you need them, you can go and find them. I think an important thing to understand is time complexity. Big O notation. And I actually did a talk at PyCon a few years ago about what is Big O notation and how do you use it. And a big point of that talk was, this is a mathematical topic that you do not have to approach mathematically. And it's a bit of a tar pit, because if you start talking about it, there's going to be some obnoxious expert who will tell you that you're doing it all wrong. And that expert is wrong. Or he's right that you're not doing it the way a theoretical mathematician would do it. And he's wrong that you're doing it in a bad way, because the way you're doing it is exactly the way a day-to-day programmer should do it. And the irony is that when I first wrote up that idea of explaining Big O, I called it How Code Slows as Data Grows. When I first wrote it up as a blog post, I got a comment from an obnoxious expert saying that I should be ashamed for explaining it wrong. Exactly that. And we got into a fight in the comments, of course. And, so be it.
And it's immortalized for all time.
It's immortalized. You can go find it on my blog. So I do think that understanding time complexity is important. Knowing where you're about to get an n-squared algorithm, and having the tools to be able to think through whether you could make it into a linear or a log n algorithm instead. And by the way, also knowing where it could be n-squared, but that's fine, because n is 10. So whatever, don't bother. Having a real-world approach to these things that understands what matters and what doesn't.
And of course, remembering that we are computer programmers, not computer scientists. I hate how people confuse that. It's like, well, I'm studying I'm a computer scientist. Okay, so what algorithms have you developed at an academic level? None. You're not a computer scientist. You're a computer programmer. They don't have anything to do with each other.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate inflation of the word science. And I forget who first said this, but if your field of study has the word science in it, then it's not science. Chemistry, biology, those are science. Physics is science. Computer science, social science, those aren't science.
I have a sociologist who would strongly disagree with you, but then again, she's a sociologist, not a social scientist. So
there you go. There you go.
Point proven.
Political science. I don't think political science is a science. But hey, it's a witticism tossed off. It's not meant to be accurate. So.
Yeah, it's an art. I love how Donald Booth called it the art of computer programming. It is an art. We can debate about the chemical makeup of the pigments. We can debate about how light refracts off the canvas, but it's not going to make one blind bit of difference to the production of the painting. The main thing is that thing looks red. This paint looks red. They match. I paint that with this. It's very simple logic.
Mm-hmm. The amazing thing is that although he called his magnum opus the art of computer programming, it might be one of the most scientific approaches to the subject. I mean, it's a really dense text. I haven't read it, but it's serious.
I read the half of the first book.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
How was it?
Extremely dry.
It's hard. It's hard.
Yep.
So Bojan, to go back to your question, what I would recommend people do is not pick up a 500-page textbook about algorithms and data structures. Or if you do, understand that you're not going to read it cover to cover. Dip into it, find out sort of what the big overview is of all the pieces, and then go and see how your language of choice, hopefully Python, actually provides those tools to you in super easy to use ways, right? It's good to know how a hash table works, and you should know that that's what a dictionary is, and the dictionary gives you everything you need to do in order to make use of it.
My two favorite books on this topic, by the way, are I like them because they are intensely practical and very funny. And so they're really good real life sort of introductions of data of algorithms and then design patterns, just in really just very 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 practical terms. One of them is called Computational Fairy Tales by Jeremy Kubica, and it's a fiction. It is a really really deliberately poorly written fantasy in which they are employing data structures and big O notation to defeat an evil wizard. And that is a great introduction to things like linked lists and NP problems and maps, and it's absolutely brilliant. But it gets down in at a deeper level to where you feel like, okay, I know what a linked list is now, without ever mucking about in, well, here's how you implement it in C, because nobody cares.
Right. I'll have to look that one up.
And then the other one is Game Programming Patterns by Robert Nystrom. And he has such a good sense of humor, but he applies many of the common design patterns to game development. And he spends more time talking about when you don't use it rather than when you use it. So he's like, okay, well, here's an example of a situation in building a game. How do we solve this problem? Well, here's how we could use the design pattern. Here's the considerations. Here's where this could fall apart. Here's some example code. And here's where you really, really, really don't want to use it because it's going to make your life miserable. And so
sounds handy.
It's a fun book. It's really easy to read because the fun little game examples and the drawings, and of course the picture on the back of him holding his dog looking terrified is just, it's brilliant.
I love that you touched on the idea of when not to use things. I think and I feel, thinking back on our conversation so far, I think we've touched on this a few times, that one of the problems when you're learning a thing is you don't know what parts you need to learn and what parts you don't need to learn. One of the reasons I did the Big O talk at PyCon was because I had a conversation with someone and they were talking about trying to get into software engineering, and they didn't have a computer science, or whatever you should call it, degree. And so they didn't have that academic background. And one of the things that they constantly felt inferior about was Big O notation. And I thought that is a perfect topic to explain to people so that they don't have to feel inferior about it. But yeah, beginners come to learn Python, and they, for instance, do they need to know how is works with integers? No, they don't need to know it. Do they need to know that tuples are microscopically faster than lists? No, they don't need to know it. There are these attractive nuisances I mentioned before, things that you're drawn to, but someone needs to tell you that's not important. Go and do a different thing.
I spent one of the reasons Dead Simple Python turned into an 800-page book is I spent so much time explaining when not to use certain things. It's like, I go into every single keyword and core feature of the language because they're going to encounter it, but I go into it with this attitude of, here's why it's here and here's why you shouldn't be using this, or here's when this is actually useful in the real world. Because that's, of course, being one of those regulars in the IRC room, that's what I see the most. It's like, well, like you said, it's like, well, when do I use this thing? And it's like, well, honestly, pickle, don't use it. If you know why you should be using it, then you can ignore my statement. It's like one of the room regulars, Grim, likes to say, if you know why you shouldn't stick a fork in a toaster, then you are qualified to stick a fork in a toaster.
Right. And that's one of the things I like about being in various communication rooms like the IRC room, is I get to see the common questions that come up, and that often leads to blog posts. And one of the blog posts, the one you just mentioned, I made a blog post called Pickle's 9 Flaws. And sometimes people in the channel will talk about pickle, and I'll say it's fine to use pickle as long as you understand all 9 of its flaws. And that's both a little bit humorous and will scare people away, but is also literally true. I don't say never use pickle. I have a tool I use every week that is based on pickle because it was the right tool for the job. And that's because I understood the 9 flaws and none of them mattered in this case. So it was great.
Exactly.
So and you used the word design patterns before. One of my pet peeves is the singleton design pattern, which is an example of something making sense in one programming domain and then just being misapplied into other programming domains where it doesn't make sense, and much simpler things will get the job done, but everyone's just drawn to it either because they've been told it's a good thing because it's mentioned in a book, or it feels fun to build that little machine that'll do that weird thing that you don't need in Python. I don't know what it is, but one of the dangers of hanging out in places like IRC is that if at any time someone mentions singleton, well, that's a half hour gone. I'm going to be ranting for half an hour now about singletons, and I just have to accept that. That's the tax of being in IRC.
Exactly. It's like saying, just either use a class with class methods and class attributes, or use a global variable and call it good.
Just make one.
Bug Hunters Café. This is Marta. We're open 24/7. We're also online at bughunters.cafe and on Twitter, Dev, and Instagram as Bug Hunters Café. Yes, the music is provided by audionautics.com. We have a link on our website. You're welcome. See you soon.
Afternoon, Marta, what's up?
We are. And down.
What in the world?
Infinity recursion. We haven't worked out how to fix it yet. On the plus side, I've been able to restock supplies this way.
Oh, I know what's going on. Asakara got into the temporal stabilizer. It happens now and then. There we are. Back to normal.
A literal bug in the system.
Well, we are the Bug Hunters Cafe.